Hello there and welcome to the English Language Club. It's time for us to hang out and learn English, and I think we've got a great show lined up for you today because we've already got quite a lot of questions in the YouTube chat. We've also got some questions in the Discord that we can go to as well. So
yes,
I guess we should jump straight into it, right?
Yeah. So first of all, hello to Rashida and Omari. You guys, excellent for showing up early and having your questions already posted. That is fantastic.
That's how to guarantee getting your questions answered.
Yeah, really.
Yeah. Yeah. But if you are just tuning in, then please do as always get your questions coming in because we'll definitely have time to get through those and more. So get those questions coming in and let's get down to it. So let's see. The first question, Rashida says, "Can you please explain how to write an essay?" Now that's a very broad question. Can you sum that up in a? Because there's different types of essay and.
The first thing to do is you need to know what kind of essay it is. Usually it'll say somewhere, and if you need to, look it up. Like an informative essay is just to tell you about something, but a persuasive essay means you have to try to convince someone. So you can't just give them information. You have to try to change their mind. But if you're not given a type, oftentimes the idea, like especially in an English class, when they're asking you to write an essay, is they just want you to write, as almost as if you're having a conversation, you're telling someone about something, right? So think to yourself, I always say the key to an essay is planning, right? So even if you don't have time to write down an outline, think, about, what do I really want to say about this topic? What's the most interesting thing? Are there any details that I can add or anything like that? And then just imagine you're explaining this to a family member. Right. So if the essay is write about what you did on your last vacation, just think back to a time that you were talking to a family member and you told them excitedly about what you did on vacation. Right. And just try to give as much detail and talk about the interesting things. Focus on what's most interesting rather than a lot of, just sort of introductory sort of things. I see a mistake a lot where people spend a lot of time setting up the details. My name is, I went to this place, and then, talk about what that means and things, where really they just want you to share your experiences and this kind of stuff. So always go for whatever is most interesting.
So Rashida goes on to say, help me please to write an essay about the difference between news reports and narrative. So
okay, I think we got a question about this. Maybe it was about the difference between a news report and a narrative. Remember, a narrative means that there's a story, like a plot.
I think it was a fiction. What's the difference between fiction and narrative that we covered about 2 weeks ago? I think.
Oh, maybe so. Yeah. So a narrative has a story to it. It can be true or false, right? It can be whatever, but there's some kind of order of events and things, one thing causes the next thing and so on. It's telling a story. A news report might be a narrative, or more likely a narrative might be part of the report, right? Say that you're looking at a news report about some international meeting or summit, right? Part of the news report will probably be the narrative. What happened, who was there, who said what, how it ended. Right, with a beginning, a middle, and an end. But the news report probably has other stuff. Probably has background details, right? It probably has commentary. It probably has, what are the consequences of this? And then some news reports don't have a narrative at all. They're just that other stuff, background, commentary, consequences. That kind of stuff with no narrative because there's no story to what happened, right?
Yeah. So would it be, in terms of structure, would it be right to say, write one paragraph to sort of kind of defining what a news story is, news report, and then what a narrative is?
I would do it the other way around.
Okay.
But yes, usually when
And
you
then
have and then combine. Usually when you have a topic that is compare and contrast, or what's the difference?
You need to define them first. Yeah.
You start with a paragraph explaining what each one is, right? So what is a narrative? I would say what is a narrative first, because it's bigger. Then what is a news report? What does a news report usually look like? Because there isn't really the definition of news report isn't going to be helpful. So write about not what does news report mean, but what are news reports usually like? What do they have in them, right? Then maybe have a paragraph saying, and so you can see, a news report often contains a narrative, but it usually has other things. But a news report doesn't always have a narrative, and so on. So then a third paragraph, or however many paragraphs, explaining how they're similar and how they're different.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. That's great, because that was a more specific question. We could give a more specific answer.
Yeah. Okay, so let's see. So Amari says, I think it's when we have could have sent in direct speech, does it remain in indirect speech or not?
So if someone said to me, hey, I could have sent you a card if I knew your address. Well, then if you were telling that story to someone else, you would say, well, he told me he could have sent me a card if he had known my address. The could have sent is already, I think it's already the same way you would put it in indirect speech.
Right.
Yeah. Because what you would change, you'd say he told me that he could have sent me, and then you change you say I could have sent you a letter if I knew your address in present, right? But then you said if he had known my address, he could have sent me a letter. If you were saying it in indirect speech, there's sometimes we've talked about this. Sometimes you move the tense in indirect speech to further in the past. So present tense becomes past tense becomes sometimes past perfect. But could have sent is already, I think, fine for indirect speech.
Okay, great. Amari, let us know if that's answered your question. We've got some more questions from you, though, so we'll get on with those.
And hello to Sonia from Honduras and Shruti, and welcome back, Susanta.
Yep, hello to all of you. Yep. And if you are just joining us, please do say hi and get those questions coming in. Amari says, teacher, why do we use the indefinite article with proper nouns? What's a proper noun, first of all?
Well, a proper noun is one that is it's a name of something, like a specific thing. So, for instance, Buckingham Palace. You capitalize it, whereas just the word palace isn't a proper noun. You wouldn't capitalize it. You don't usually use with proper nouns. Like no one would say, that's a Tony. Sometimes you do. Someone might say, their house is practically a Buckingham Palace. And what you're saying is it's like another, like it was like Buckingham Palace, but it's not the Buckingham Palace. It's a different one. Same thing when we say the or the before a proper noun. You're recognizing, okay, there are others of these, but this is the real one. I am the Tony Culpa, or whatever. But most of the time, you don't use an article before a proper noun. Again, we talked about this last time. One of the purposes of an article is it's called a determiner. It shows you which one. And so you don't use an article if you're using a different determiner. Like my coat, I don't say the my coat or my the coat. It's just my coat. You already know which one. So proper nouns, you already know which one. You don't need an extra determiner. So you don't usually say my Colin or my Buckingham Palace or anything like that because it's understood which one. Again, sometimes people say it, but usually proper nouns don't get a determiner.
Right. Okay, great. Thanks. I hope that's helpful, Amari. Let us know if that's answered your question. And another question from Amari. We will get on to other questions coming in. We just work our way through from sort of top to bottom. So yeah, please do get your questions coming in so they're ready for us when we get there. So Amari says, I know that the pronoun they is used when we don't know who the person we don't know who is the person who does an action.
So the subject is unknown.
Example? Yeah.
So I don't know if this is necessarily true or if this is the main way you would show that. If you don't know who the subject is, the two main ways we would say that is we would use a word like someone. Like someone robbed the bank. Or you rephrase it to be in passive. The bank was robbed. Because then you don't have to say who the subject is.
Yeah, the subject becomes the thing that you do know, the thing that has your action done to it.
Now, but if what you mean is you know that it was, like, say, that person over there, you know who it was, but you don't know who that person is, that's when you would use they. So someone said, someone stole my bag. So again, you say someone, meaning I don't know who it was. Then now that you've introduced that person as someone, you would say, they ran that way, right? They, because you don't know who they are specifically.
Yeah,
but
and you don't know he or she or...
Really, they is just referring back to someone. They is the pronoun you use. Not that as the subject doesn't mean anything, but they is the pronoun you use to refer to an earlier person that you've identified, but with something vague, either with like something like someone. So once you've introduced it with someone, then you would, after that, use they. Just like if you introduce someone by the name and then you use he or she. Like, this is my friend Colin. He is the host of Inside English, English Language Lab, so on. That's how you would use they. But you don't start with that. You wouldn't, if you just said, they robbed me, people would think you meant a group of people. So you have to start by saying something like, someone robbed me. Yeah. Or I was robbed.
If anyone knows about computer programming, it's kind of like defining a variable.
Yes. In English, in grammar, it's called an antecedent. Like, you establish who you're talking about, then you can use a pronoun. And they is the correct pronoun to use once you've already established that you're talking about some vague, unidentified person. We also use they sometimes when we're trying to be polite and we don't need to refer to someone's gender. So we don't want to use he or she. Sometimes because we're talking about, like a person, that isn't actually there. And that person could be a male or a female. So we use they as a gender neutral pronoun as well. So that's kind of related to what you're saying.
Yeah. Now, I think obviously we haven't mentioned this, but I think the confusion here is that they is normally used as the sort of plural when referring to more than one person, but it is also used to refer to a single person, not a single, you know what I mean, singular, as well in these situations.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, great. So another one. Oh, we've got two more from Amari, I think. In which situation do we use the expression couldn't help remembering? I couldn't help remembering. Now, that is an expression, but what?
Do you mean I couldn't help but remember?
Yeah, I think you can use either.
Yeah. Oh, no, that's right. Yeah. So it means the same thing. I couldn't help but remember, or I couldn't help remembering, though.
I think it's when you if you're talking to somebody and you want to raise a topic, you could say, I couldn't help remembering, Tony, that you lived in Haiti for a while. If it's something that you talked about or you heard about last time. So that's one way you could use it.
Yeah, couldn't help but remember is basically a way of saying, oh, that reminds me, right? You're saying that made me think of this. That made me remember. And we just say, I couldn't help but remember, in the same way you would say, I couldn't help but notice. Couldn't help but is a way of, again, in English, being very indirect is more polite. So if you want to make an observation and you really don't want to because you feel like people might think it's rude, you might have to say, I couldn't help but notice you've gained weight, or I couldn't help but notice you look really sick, or something like that. It's just a way to make it indirect and therefore less immediately aggressive. Now, the thing with I couldn't help remembering, or I couldn't help but remember, I'm not sure it really means that, or if it's just become a figure of speech, though that is where it comes from, is the idea of when you say, oh, that reminds me of something, but I want to be a little extra polite about it. But I don't really think that's how people use it now so much as it's just an idiom for, oh, that makes me think of whatever. Yeah. So it just makes you think of it, or it makes you remind it, or it reminds you of something. You say, I couldn't help but notice, or I couldn't help but remember, rather. Yeah.
Great. Okay, and the last thing for now from Amari is not so much a question, but referring to the first question about essays. So, in fact, we are usually asked to write an essay about a quote. So what do you advise us to write in such
a kind of essay?
Such a type of essay, yeah.
Oh, man. That is actually a really challenging kind of essay to write, because if you don't know anything about the quote, I mean, if it's a super familiar quote and everyone in your area should know it, then that's different. But if it's just some random quote, that can be very challenging because you often don't know what it's actually referring to. And you have to basically, it might be a test of your reading comprehension. Like, can you figure out from the quote what this person is trying to talk about? Do you have any specific advice for that kind of thing, Colin?
I mean, it's probably something that you would have studied in class, a quote from Shakespeare or something. So you may have, they're normally testing. It's not going to be completely out of the blue, or it shouldn't be. It's normally, but I guess that sort of essay question is normally going to be just a way of asking a question, but making it very broad, so you can almost say whatever you want.
So that's true. Like sometimes, like for instance, someone asked last week or a couple weeks ago about the poem "Falling Leaves," and one of the neat things about a poem is that unless you've studied it and done some research on it, you're not necessarily going to know what it's actually talking about, right? So this depends on whether you're given an assignment as homework or whether you have to write something in class. If you're given an assignment as homework to write something about a poem or about a quote, look it up. Find out what the context was. Why did that person say it? What was that person trying to accomplish? Right? And then you can explain that. But if you're just
what was going on in the world at the time. Yeah.
Right. The context, right? But if you're just given a quote or a poem in class, then you don't know that stuff. Now, if it's something you've learned in class, you should know it. But if it's not, then oftentimes this is just an invitation to write about whatever the poem makes you think about, right? And sometimes the same for a quote. I've sometimes seen really deep quotes from ancient Greek philosophers, for example, that someone says, write about this quote from Plato. And usually you don't know enough about it to really be able to write about what that person was trying to say. So you just write about what you think about those words, right? If someone gives you a quote like Roosevelt, we have nothing to fear except fear itself. Now you might not know, okay, so he was talking, was he talking about the Great Depression? Was he talking about World War II? You might not know that. Then what does that make you think, right? What do you think about being afraid of fear, right? And then you just write about your own thoughts. So like you said, it allows you to just really write about whatever you want, as long as you can connect it to that poem or that quote. Yeah.
Great. Okay, well, thank you so much for your questions, Omari, and let us know if that's been helpful.
I just want to quickly because Shruti asked a question about what kind of question you can ask. So I want to answer very quickly.
Sure.
You can ask any question you want. We might not be able to give you a very good answer in the time we have, or we might not get to the answer. But feel free to ask. We might be able to give you a really good answer.
Yeah. I mean, by all means, ask. If we can't answer, we'll say so.
Or if we feel like it will take too much time, or it's not really. Every now and then, for instance, Jack asks a question that's so philosophical that I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but I try to give him a short answer. Yeah. Or we do.
Great. Okay. Now we got a few questions now from Susanna.
Great.
First one is, what does "get the girl" mean? And she actually gave us some a quote with that in context. So. We're all so afraid of uncertainty that we want a guarantee before we even try. We want evidence that if we take a risk, we will get the girl. It's a numbers game. To play any game, you have to start.
Yeah, that's a good quote.
What does "get the girl" mean?
So this is actually a metaphor about literature. Actually, in so many stories, movies, books, fairy tales. The young hero does something heroic, and then he gets the girl. Whatever the princess, he rescues her, and they get married. If it's a teen movie, the guy is able to impress the most popular girl in school, and they go on a date. Whatever. And so
it's almost like the subtext of almost every kind of action movie, and
right. Well, so many narratives are really about. On some level, it's a romance. So it's whether he and she will get together, right? So, but broader, since this is so common in so many kinds of literature, this idiom, "get the girl," means you win, you accomplish whatever your goal was, and you get rewarded for it. So "get the girl" is an idiom it's a metaphor for being rewarded for your heroic work. Or succeeding, right? Like you're the character in a story, and so you win at the end, right? And so what the quote is talking about is we only want to try things sometimes if we know we're going to succeed, if we know we're going to accomplish our goal. But real world is not like a story. You're not going to accomplish your goal every time. You have to keep trying in order to eventually win, right? Yeah, "get the girl" is a very common phrase. That's a good question, Susanna.
Yeah. Great. Okay, let's move on to the next one from Susanna as well. What does "couldn't have concluded that" mean?
Oh,
so
that actually could mean two sort of things, and they're kind of opposite. But I think what you're looking for is. Concluded could mean figure out, right? So I couldn't have concluded that means I couldn't have figured that out. So based on the information they had, they would not have been able to come to that conclusion. Or it means like based on this information, I wouldn't decide that, right? So you could say the inspectors couldn't have concluded that there was nothing illegal going on. Basically, you're saying it was obvious there was illegal stuff going on. Yeah, so it either means you couldn't have figured it out based on the evidence, or you couldn't have decided, right? Based on the evidence.
Okay, great. Yeah, I hope that's helpful, Susanna. Let us know if that makes sense. We've got another question here from Susanna. What does the phrase "terrific staff" there mean? I think that's just literal, isn't it? So terrific means very good, excellent, and staff are the people who work somewhere, and obviously. So I don't think there's anything, any metaphor going on there.
Just that the people who work there are really good.
Whoever said this is just making a compliment about a place they visited, or a shop or something like that. Yeah. Great. Okay. Let's see. Another one from Susanna. What's the difference between except and except for.
Oh, okay.
So you could say, I like all food except sausages. But you could also say, I like all food except for sausages. Those are both right, aren't they? Is it so you can use them interchangeably in a way?
You can use them interchangeably. Most of the time, I would say they're interchangeably. They're interchangeable. I'm trying to remember what the actual there's one thing that you can that except for means that's separate. I can't think of it off the top of my head.
I've just done a quick Google. I can read what it says here. It says, as a rule of thumb, use except when you are talking about a group of things and want to single out part of that group. So that's what I did with my sausages example. And use except for when describing a state and something that invalidates that state.
Oh, yes. Like I'm feeling fine except for this headache. Right. Yes. So you can say except for, like, I like all sausages except spicy sausages, or I like all sausages except for spicy sausages. They're the same.
So they're interchangeable.
But you can say except for when you're saying when you're talking about verbs or like a state of being, like like I feel great except for I have a headache. I can't think of another example. That's the only kind I can think of when people say, the movie was really cool except for that one scene, or the meeting went very well except for what Steve said or whatever.
This live stream was really good apart from the bit where I had to use Google.
Yeah, I think it's something.
Except
like
for. So apart. I said apart for. Except for. So apart for and except for, I guess, are similar in that way.
Yeah, that's a bit of a tricky one. I can't think of any. I mean, I guess I gave 3 examples, so that's good enough.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, let's see.
Now, we missed a question from Shruti. I'm not sure how well we can answer this. The one about transferred epithets. So transferred epithets is from a list of like poetic or literary devices or something like that. It's really kind of obscure, and I can't think of a situation where someone would need to know this unless they are taking a class on literary devices or something. If I remember correctly, it's like when you say, "Oh, it was a gloomy day," but what you really mean is you were gloomy. You were gloomy on that day, but you say it was a gloomy day, or you could say, I had an awful night. Well, the night wasn't awful. There was nothing wrong with the night, but it was awful for you, right? And we use this all the time, like someone. The cruel sun in the desert. Well, the sun isn't cruel, but you feel cruelty on you because of the hot sun or something like that. So it's where you call something by an epithet, you're describing it, is what it's called. But that thing isn't really described that way. The sun isn't really cruel. A day can't be terrible. I mean, the day is just the day, but you felt terrible on that day. So that's examples. But again, I don't knowing what that's called. I don't think is very important unless you need to know it for a class.
Yeah. Okay. Now we're going to move on to a question from Gabrielle. But first, just another. Was that a question from Sonia?
Oh,
that was Shruti. Yeah. Okay.
Shruti. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So we got one from Gabrielle and then Sonia after that. So Gabrielle says, "Can you talk about the verb to have? Last time Tony talked about to get, and that was very interesting. Thanks in advance." So to have is another verb that is
very
used in lots of different ways, like to get. But to have is used in lots of different ways because it's a auxiliary verb. So it's used for the perfect tenses. So yeah, do you want to add any, what?
Well, so last week I talked about, or whenever it was, I talked about how get is like become. So generally speaking, there are two ways that we talk about, in English at least, and in many other languages, that we talk about describing things. For example, we either say it is or it has, right? So for instance, in English, we say, he is 40 years old. But for instance, in Spanish, the way you say it is he has 40 years, right? And also in French, you say he has 40 years. And the reason is like is and has, you can have attributes or qualities, right? And even, like has doesn't just mean whole. Have doesn't just mean possess. Well, it does mean possess, but you can possess, for instance, a delightful personality. You can say he has a delightful personality, or you say he has a temper, right? So there's this, you can say he is angry is sort of short term. He has a temper is a quality of that person. So we use these two different words to describe, something, either is or have. And sometimes there's patterns as to why, but sometimes it's just, in some languages, certain things get connected with the idea of having something. And in other languages, it's more connected to being something, right? And then last week, we talked about how each of these have a version where it's changing, right? The changing version of is become, right? I am hungry. Well, you became hungry over the course of the morning, although we'd probably say got there. But and then the changing version of that is get, right? He has a temper, and his temper got worse because it's changing, right? So hopefully that will help you a little bit. But like Colin said, have is particularly interesting. Well, these is and have and become and get, they're so core to our language that they get mixed in with as auxiliary verbs, right? So just like get is sometimes used with the passive, have is used with all the perfect tenses, right? It's such a core part of the language that it gets used in a lot of different ways.
Yeah, and in a way, I think have is more core, if it's fair to say, because it is an auxiliary verb that defines one of the tenses, and in our course,
one of the whole types of tenses, like the whole aspect of perfect. Yeah,
and one of the main lessons of our course is that auxiliary verbs are the most important thing for tenses. We think
absolutely.
We often think it's the form of the verb, but this is because we normally learn the past simple first, which does change the form of the verb. But actually, it's far more important to look at the auxiliary verb. So when you have the auxiliary verb have, that's making a perfect tense, like I have eaten or I have lost my keys. We know that it's perfect from the auxiliary verb. We do change the form of the verb. So I have eaten, so eat becomes eaten, but we also use that form of the verb if it's passive, like you could say that sausage was eaten. So that is not perfect.
But you can tell by the was instead of have. If it was have, then it was perfect. Since there's no have, it's not perfect.
Right. So it's not that form of the verb that tells us what the tense is. It's actually the auxiliary verb. So have is really crucial to English.
Very important. Yeah. And those four verbs are they all have similar concepts to them. Maybe one day I'll talk about become. Not today though. But Gabrielle said that in Italian it's also you have an age, and that I think goes back to Latin. In Latin, you talk about having an age. But again, in some other languages, you are 20 years old or whatever. It really is interesting, how each language chooses to say is or has. And to Sonia, yes, has is the third person. present of have. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Great.
Well,
Yeah.
that was
Okay. So, yeah, that was great. So I hope that's helpful, Gabrielle. Let us know. So Sonia now has a question about grammar. Well, I don't understand when I can use possessive pronouns and possessive determiners. Sorry, my grammar is no good. I'm just learning 5 months.
Well,
English.
good for you.
So, wow,
Yes.
that's really impressive.
Very good. Your English is obviously better than my Spanish was after learning for 5 months, and definitely better than my Creole was after my first 5 months in Haiti. So I think this is referring back to what we were talking about earlier about you don't need an or a the before a word if you have some other determiner. And there are lots of determiners. A possessive pronoun, my, is a determiner. There are some that are like adjectives, like the first, second, or third. All right. And in that case, you would usually use a the with them as well, because they are, I don't know what the word for it is, but there's some, it's an adjective, but it's not necessarily.
Ordinals.
Well, they are, but that's not what makes them not determiners. But there are some other ones. Let me see. Someone gave an example. Yeah. Idia 69 gave the example, I will see him the next week. And here, next is a determiner. So you don't need the. It's just, I will see him next week, right? So any word that can be a determiner usually means you don't need an or a the with it, right? So you don't say this is my shirt. It's just my shirt. This isn't, the next day. It's just next day, right? Our next week. I'll see him next week, and so on. So usually you don't need a determiner and an article. Now, if Sonia's asking about possessive pronouns or possessive determiners, usually you just use whatever works, right? When you use a possessive pronoun, that's just kind of going to be what's natural to use there, right? You wouldn't say, so this is the shirt. Well, it's my shirt. So I would just say my shirt instead of saying the shirt. Now that's not the same in many languages, right? You just use the instead of my if it's sort of understood, but we don't do that in English. In English, if it belongs to someone, you just use the possessive pronoun or the possessive adjective, right?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I mean, and we've talked about in the past how with grammar and phonetics about there's sort of learning to use grammar, and then there's learning grammar as a subject. And you don't necessarily need to know grammar. Like native speakers don't know grammar necessarily of their language. So yeah, I think it's important to know what your goals are, Sonia. If it is just to be able to speak English and be understood, then I mean, you don't necessarily need to know all these terms. They're not necessarily helpful. Well, they're meant to be helpful, and if
they're helpful,
not,
yeah, exactly. Like for instance, to ask questions, right? It's useful to know what the word is for it, right? But they don't necessarily they might make it easier to study, but they aren't going to actually change the way you speak. Right? And
it's quite possible. Most people learn, especially when you're native speakers, and I think most students who are learning English as a second language don't, they pick these things up kind of instinctively from listening to native speakers, and and things just sort of make sense in their head without actually knowing what these things are called. So yeah, you're doing really well. If you've only been studying English for 5 months, that's amazing.
Yeah, good job. And we're glad to have you here.
Yeah. So let's see. AJ in Monaco.
Welcome, AJ.
He says, any tricks to remember synonyms as I'm trying to widen my vocabulary? That's an interesting question. So synonym is when you've got more than one word for the same thing.
Or they mean something very similar.
Yeah.
Well, so if it's two different words that mean the same thing, so there's more than one word for something. When I was in secondary school, so a while ago, I had a book that was designed. It was for how to memorize long lists of things, and the book recommended that you come up with a mental image, a mental picture of the thing, whatever it is you're trying to remember, and then you somehow add into that picture the letters of the word that you're looking for. So, for example, we talk all the time about how in British English you call what you call the pavement. In American or Canadian English, we call the sidewalk. So, for instance, if I was trying to remember using this technique that the British word for sidewalk was pavement, then I would try to come up with a mental image with a P in it. For example, someone is writing it, like, you know how some people like write their name in wet cement as it's hardening. Someone is writing a giant P or something like that. This kind of thing. Incorporate a letter into your mental image, because sometimes mental images are easier to remember than words are, especially if you're more of a kind of a visual person. So when you're trying to learn any kind of vocabulary, for some people, again, this is a tool. It won't work for everybody, but for some people it will work. Come up with an image of it. If the image is funny or something like that, it's easier to remember. So this kind of thing. And then if you have any art skills, you can even draw it out. It'll help you remember it. Now, again, that I've had mixed results with this technique. But when it works, it's hilarious. So that's an idea that might work for you, AJ. It'd be worth trying.
Yeah. But again, this is the kind of thing that you're not going to use this as you're speaking. Really.
Exactly.
It's just to help you remember it at the beginning, and then once you become more fluent, that will become second nature, like with all vocabulary. This is actually also a good technique for remembering names, doing something visual. Like if you know somebody, if you meet someone called Peter and you want to remember their name, you can imagine them. Think of someone you do know called Peter, or something that whatever comes to mind when you say Peter. Imagine that, and then put that person into that image. Like you could have maybe Peter Rabbit. You think of Peter Rabbit. So you could put that person, Peter, who you've just met, into that picture next to Peter Rabbit. And then that could help you remember that person's name is Peter Rabbit. Because you see their face, and then that picture will automatically kind of come to mind with the rabbit there. And you think, oh, yeah, he's Peter Rabbit.
The nice thing about synonyms is that you can have multiple words in the same image. Right? Connect multiple words to that image, and it helps you remember the fact that they're synonyms. But remember, tricks are great, but the reality is the only thing that is going to help your brain remember something is by using it. As with anything, the not the shortcut answer, but the real answer is practice it. Be intentional about using those words. Don't try to just memorize lists of words. Think of a word and then try to use that word today, right? And then the next day, try a different word. Try to use it, right? Don't try to memorize more than you can actually use in a day or a week or however long you're giving yourself, right? Just practice, though. Practice isn't a trick. It just takes work, right?
Yeah. Now, that actually ties in very well with this next question from Gabrielle. The sound. I have no difficulty in physically producing the sound or sounds, but I struggle to remember which words require the voiced sound and which ones the unvoiced one. Is there a rule? So, yeah, I mean, it goes back to what you were just saying, Tony. There's not really a rule, is there? It's just a question of practice. And I think maybe perhaps Gabrielle, you need to do more listening practice with your studying. If you're seeing a word and you're not sure whether it's pronounced or it's I mean, I can understand that if you're doing a lot of reading, because I don't think there is really a rule, is there? Which when I mean, with most pronunciation, the rule is it's whatever kind of is more natural physically. So sometimes, it's going to be, it leads into that sound more naturally. But there isn't really a rule, as in like if the next letter is an I.
Right. Certainly nothing as simple as like the rule for G's, right? Or C's. One thing, because this is one of those annoying things where there's that sound has like just with a G or a C, like where it has two completely different sounds, though very closely related. If you're writing, make some kind of a mark, like underline it if it's the voiced, the as opposed to th, or something, to help remind you visually. But yes, it really is just a matter of once you've said that, think. Is it think or think? Once you've said it dozens and dozens and dozens of times, you won't have to stop and pause to think about it before you say the unvoiced th. It just does take practice, but any shortcut you can come up with to help you remember as you're practicing can be useful. Look up the word, Google it, and then click the pronunciation thing and listen to it, and then like write it down. Put a note to yourself. This is voiced, unvoiced.
But also say it out loud.
Say
because,
it. Yes.
Like we say, pronunciation is always physical. So physically making the sound will make, or practicing physically making the sound is going to train you to make that sound correctly when you need to, much more than just knowing that it's voiced or unvoiced. This is how we get to that point where it's natural and second nature, and we don't need to think about it. If you never do any speaking, you'll never get to that stage.
Yeah. And it's communicating too. But yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Question
great.
from
Thanks. Go you.
You.
It says, who will you ride with? On my own, your grace. This question is why not using whom instead of who. Okay, so why is it
not whom will you ride with, or with whom will you ride, right? And the answer to that, I mean, if it's saying your grace, I'm curious as to whether this is some historical quote or if this is modern. We've talked about this before on the live stream, that technically you use whom if it's the object of the sentence, in a sense, this is the object of the sentence, which is why it's a who. But also, using whom is something that is becoming less and less necessary. Honestly, unless you are writing legal document level of formal, or your teacher happens to be an incredibly grammar obsessed person, and in details, very rarely do people say whom anymore strictly. Yeah. They might say it, with whom, if they're trying to sound like, they'll say it the same way. Sometimes you say the, and sometimes you say the, right? Like they won't say it because it's grammatically right or wrong, but because they're trying to emphasize something or trying to sound a certain way. But nowadays, there really is no reason to say whom instead of who, or not. You shouldn't have to, right? It's not that there's no reason, but that you shouldn't be required to. But a lot of places and a lot of people will still argue that you should. But if you're just reading, like if you're looking in literature, most of the time they're not going to be particular about using whom instead of who.
Yeah, great. Okay, I hope that's helpful, Gogo. Let us know if it is. Now, there's a question here from, is that Edith?
Idia? Yeah, we answered this one earlier, but yeah.
Okay, yeah. Okay. Okay, we'll skip that one then for now. Yeah, so quick question. Sonia says, has is the third person? Yes, so has is the third person form of have. Yeah. So I have lived in England all my life. That's a present perfect tense statement, but he has. So I have, he has. Yeah, so it's the third person. You're right. Okay. So another question here from Gogo U. Don't you understand what this means? They'll separate us. The question is, why not saying what does this mean instead of what this means? So Gogo's asking, why is it not saying, don't you understand what does this mean?
Yeah. So well, first of all, if you said, what does this mean? Then that's a question. That makes it a question.
Well, it is a question already because it starts with, don't you understand?
But what this means is not the question. The question is do you understand? Do you understand is the question, right? Mm. The part that comes after that, even though there's a question mark, that part is not a question, right? That's the question, do you understand what? Understand what this means, right?
Yeah.
So that part isn't a question. It's the earlier part that's a question. But your question is still valid. Why do they not phrase it as a question, right? And that's because this is a negative question. Instead of asking, do you understand? They're asking, don't you understand? Right.
But you could also say, do you understand what this means?
You could actually say, do you understand what this means? And still, what this means is not put as a question.
Yeah. But then it's not a negative question.
Yeah. So you wouldn't say, you never double question things just like you don't double negative. You wouldn't say, do you understand what does this mean? No, in English, we don't do that. There's only one verb that has been inverted with its subject to make it a question per question. So it's just, do you understand what this means? Not, do you understand what does this mean? All right. Some languages do this. Once you start a question, every verb is written as a question. English does not. No. So that's a very interesting question. It's actually more deep than someone might think, because yes, that does happen in a lot of languages.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Thanks. I hope that's helpful, Gogo. Let us know if it is. Now we've got a question from Shruti.
Okay.
So I think Shruti was asking what type of question she can ask.
Yeah, whether it was okay to ask a literature question. Yeah.
Yeah. So discuss the art and its two broad classifications of fine art and lesser art by the point of view of literature. So I think this is a bit deep for this not podcast, but live stream. Yeah. But do you want to just?
I can give a quick answer. So there's people often talk about two kinds of art, and everyone agrees that one kind is called fine art, but no one agrees on what to call the other kind. You might call it studio art or applied art, or I don't like the term lesser art. But the difference between fine art and whatever the other kind of art is, honestly, depending on it's hard to decide whether something fits in. Some things are obviously fine art and some things are obviously not. But the area between them can be blurry and depends on the person. But fine art is something that's done for its significance, its beauty, its depth, right? A masterpiece of a painting or a great novel in literature, Shakespeare. The lesser arts are things that are done for some other purpose as well. Like, a plate that is a really well done design on it, but it's still used for eating, right? That's an applied art because it has a use, right?
Or if something is just designed to look kind of pretty, but not like deep and powerful and significant, could also be, studio art or decorative art. So in books, something that's just designed to entertain you would be considered whatever that other kind is. But a book that's written to be great and deep and profound would be called fine art. But the reality is that, someone could be trying to be deep and profound and fail. And so it's just not that great. Or some people might think of it as deep and profound and other people not. The perfect example, the pinnacle of fine art in literature in English is Shakespeare. But Shakespeare wasn't writing to be for the ages, to be so deep and profound. He was writing what was considered, pretty low class entertainment for the time, like plays, right? He was just writing to be entertaining, to be funny. There's a lot of crude jokes in Shakespeare, for example. But Shakespeare was so good at what he did that for hundreds of years, we have seen the depth and beauty. And so we call his literature fine art. So again, I'm really big on the fact that these two distinctions they should not exist. It's not a real thing. It really just, each work of art is should be judged on its own. But that's what the difference is. Probably gave too long an answer there.
What you're saying there about Shakespeare reminds me of the other podcast that I do, which is about storytelling. And I do that with a writer called Ross Lawhead. And one of the episodes we did there, I remember, was about what is it that makes a good story. And Ross was explaining how it's truth that makes a good story. And in a way, it's that same, so it doesn't need to be a true story, but it speaks to something, a deeper truth about the human condition. And I think that's what Shakespeare did well, and that's why his work has lasted so long. And I think that is maybe what you're getting at with the kind of fine art. It's
exactly
something that speaks to a deeper truth of the human condition that makes it last through the ages.
And so, if lesser art is something that is supposed to be practical or for a use, well, that doesn't mean it can't be deep and speak to the truth of the human condition. I mean, if we're talking about literature, there are books that people wrote just because they desperately needed the money, that they wrote as quickly as they possibly could, that are among the best books ever written. And if you go broader than just written literature, I've seen television commercials that were deeper and more profound than some, really famous movies, right? There's nothing that says that any kind of art can't be incredibly deep and speak to the truth of the human condition just because of what kind of art it is. But the reality is that art that does that, literature or any other kind, is a lot rarer. There's a lot of art out there that isn't beautiful and deep and profound. And so people are always trying to come up with ways to say this, that not all art is fine art. But the reality is it's not based on what kind of art it is. It's really just, the artist and the moment and the inspiration and all that stuff.
Yeah. Okay. Well, this is a huge topic that people could come in and debate this for hours.
We literally could have a whole podcast on this.
Yeah. Yeah. So well, I do.
Exactly. Yeah. Storytelling.
So Shruti, I hope that's helpful. It's given you something to think about. I think we're running out of time, so we got a couple more questions. Good one here from Peter 3, who says, "How do you pronounce the word mature and immature in British English?" So I just modeled them for you. So mature and immature. It's that we say that we don't say mature like you might say more in American. Would you, Tony?
Oh no, I don't. Some people do. Occasionally, you hear someone saying mature, but that's not the common pronunciation.
Right, but it's the T that is the confusing thing in this word. And especially in British English, it's always going to be more of a ch sound than a t sound. So great. So We've got time for one more. This last one from Gogo, and then we'll have to draw things to a close. Okay, Gogo says, all I know is that a man that didn't know. All I know is that a man that didn't know who
you were,
who you were, was with you in that room for half an hour. The question is, why not say who were you?
Right.
Inversion in question instead of who you were.
And again, because it's not a question. All I know is that a man that didn't know who you were was with you in that room for half an hour. You could just say, it's a statement. I didn't know who you were. The man didn't know who you were. It's not a question. Who doesn't need to be a question word. Just like what doesn't need to be a question word. They have their own uses. We use them with questions, but that's not their only use. Just like have is an auxiliary verb, but it's not only an auxiliary verb. It does other things as well.
It's confusing, isn't it? Because we do talk about, those as question words: what, where, when, why, and we do think of them as being used for questions, but they're not always used as questions. I think that's what's confusing you here.
Yes, definitely.
Was it, in this context, is who being used as a determiner? Because we were talking about determiners earlier. Who you were, it's not.
It's a relative clause. He didn't know who you were, so yeah. We talked about relative clauses a few weeks ago. They're one of my favorite things, but they can be very tricky.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Okay. So that's all we've got time for today. Unfortunately, there are a few questions we didn't quite get to. But like I said earlier, we do have a Discord channel, and there is a Discord server, and there is a channel in the server for people to give questions for the live stream. And actually, we had some in there that we didn't get to today. So maybe next week we'll have to just do the Discord questions and not do any from the chat or something. I don't know. But that is. If you've got any questions that we didn't get to, head on over to Discord and put them in the chat there, and we will get to them in a future live stream. So I think that's everything for today. So thank you for watching, if you have been, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.